Today we begin a new series entitled How to Get Through Trials and Tests. And I'm basing this series on James chapter 1. Now, one of the most difficult parts of the Christian life is the fact that becoming a follower of Christ does not make us immune to the trials and tests of life. Now the question is, why would a good and loving God allow us to go through things such as the death of a child, disease and injury to ourselves and our loved ones, or even suffering financial hardships or things like worry and fear? I mean, after all, if He really loves us, wouldn't He take all these things away from us? Doesn't loving us mean He wants our lives to be easy and comfortable? Well, the answer is no, it doesn't. The Bible clearly teaches that God loves us as His children, and He works all things together for our good, even in the midst of the trials and testings we experience, according to Romans chapter 8, verse 28. Now, in applying that to our lives, that means then that the trials and testing He allows in our lives are part of His working all things together for our good. So for a Christian, all the trials and tests that we experience have a divine purpose in God developing and strengthening our faith. Because God's ultimate purpose for us is to grow more and more into the image of His Son, Jesus Christ, that we become like Him in our lives, according to Romans 8:29. You see, this is God's goal for the Christian, and everything in life, including our trials and tests, are designed to enable us to reach that goal. It's part of the process of God sanctifying us or setting us apart for His purposes and teaching us how to live in order that we might please Him. Now today, I want us to look at Genesis chapter 22 together. And in Genesis chapter 22, we see the story of Abraham when he was faced with the most severe test imaginable. I want you to listen as I read, beginning in verse 1 of that chapter. Sometime later, God tested Abraham, and He said to him, "Abraham?" "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." So essentially, God says to him, "Abraham, take your only son Isaac, whom you love, and not just your son, but your only son, whom you love, and offer him for a burnt offering." I mean, to me, that's incredible. Abraham, I want a sacrifice out of you, and I want it to be a human sacrifice. I want your only son, and I want you to kill him as an offering to me. Now, what's so interesting about this is that it was a pagan practice. That was a pagan thing to do. You see, no believer would ever offer his child as a human sacrifice to God. And furthermore, this was the son God had promised to Abraham and Sarah. You'll remember that not only was Sarah, Abraham's wife, barren and unable to bear children, but both she and Abraham were well beyond childbearing years. So why would God call for human sacrifice when He had never called for a human sacrifice before? And for God to do that would be the opposite of everything that Abraham knew to be true about God. I mean, why would God go to great lengths to enable a man and a woman nearing 100 years of age who had been barren all of their lives to produce a son, and then ask that they kill that son? Why would God make a promise to Abraham that he would be the father of many nations and that his descendants would be as the sands of the sea and the stars of heaven, and then kill the only child that he had given him in his old age, through which that promise would happen? I mean, when you think about the whole idea, it was absolutely bizarre, because all hope of this promise God had made being fulfilled through his son Isaac would die with Isaac. And what makes it even more severe is just not that Isaac was to die, but listen to this, that Abraham, his own father, was to be the one to kill him. I mean, it's absolutely incredible and incredulous when you think about it. It's one thing to have the one you love die, but it's a whole nother level when you're told that you're to be the one to kill that person. I mean, it's really unthinkable, truly. And we would have understood if Abraham had said, "Look, God, can you explain this, please? This makes no sense to me. I can't do that." But notice his response. Verse 3 says this: "Early in the morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about." Now notice here, instead of questioning God, he gets up early in the morning, gets ready to leave, and he goes and he cuts the wood. He even had to cut his own wood to put his son on to burn him as a sacrifice to God after he would have killed him and taken his life. And it says he rose up and he went to the place where God told him to go. I mean, what an amazing man. Absolutely amazing man. No questioning, no delay, no argument with God, no dispute, no reaction, just simple obedience to what God told him to do. Well, 3 days later, we read this in verses 4 and 5. "On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, 'Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you.'" Now here's the secret, and I want you to keep this in mind. Listen to this. He said to his servants, "We will go and worship, and then we will come back." Look at verse 6. "Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. And he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, 'Father?' 'Yes, my son,' Abraham replied. 'The fire and wood are here.' Isaac said, 'But where is the lamb for the burnt offering?' Abraham answered, 'God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son.' And the 2 of them went on together." I mean, this is absolutely gut-wrenching as you read it. A trusting son who trusts his father who doesn't know what's going on. And he says to his father about this act of worship, "Where's the lamb?" And Abraham says, "My son, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering." You see, I think that deep down in Abraham's heart, he knew that God had a plan that was consistent with God's character and consistent with God's covenant promise to him to make a great nation out of him, and through his son Isaac would be named many descendants. I don't know that he knew what that plan actually was, but I think he had a good idea that God had a plan that was consistent with God's character and consistent with God's covenant promise to him. Verse 9 tells us this: "When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son." We're told that when they came to the place that God had told him, Abraham built the altar, laid the wood in order, and then he bound Isaac, his son. Now notice, and I think it's important, there was no struggle on Isaac's part either against his father. Abraham tied him up and laid him on the altar, and then Abraham took the knife and he lifted it up to plunge it into his son, to kill his son. I mean, it's unbelievable, isn't it? Do you understand by reading this story what it means when it says Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness? Do you understand why the New Testament says that Abraham is the father of the faithful? He is the greatest single model of trust in God that the Bible knows anything about apart from Jesus Christ. And the man is at the point of plunging the knife into the very body of his own son. I mean, it's an unthinkable thing. I mean, what a trial, what a test. Contradictory, indescribably painful for him. It's murderous, inconsistent with everything Abraham knew about God, and yet notice that he's submissive to God. He's obedient, and he will worship God no matter what the cost, even if it entails the life of his own son, taking his life. And so God took Abraham's action to sacrifice his own son as an act of obedience. God judged Abraham on his willingness to obey, and he did not make him carry out the act of killing his own son. In fact, verse 11 says, "But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, 'Abraham, Abraham.' 'Here I am,' he replied. 'Do not lay a hand on the boy,' he said. 'Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son.'" You see, this was a test, and the question is, did Abraham pass? Yes, he passed with flying colors. Why? Because he was willing to obey God no matter what the cost, what the test, or what the trial. God says, "You have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Now, what this example of Abraham shows us is that we might be tested in things that are very dear to us. We might be tested in things very dear to us or close to us, like a son or a daughter, a husband or a wife, or even a friend. We may have to offer up our own Isaac, give the ones we love most over to the Lord, not only in death, but maybe in life, letting them go the way that God wants them to go, and not necessarily the way we want them to go or to live their lives. You see, when Abraham was willing to give up Isaac, no matter how much his son meant to him, he showed that he wasn't possessive, but that he would release him to do God's will. Why? Because he would do anything that God asked him to do. Abraham would do anything that God required of him or asked him to do. Now, we all have a lot of trials in life, don't we? But I can't ever imagine a trial like that. Can you? I can't imagine what I would do if God told me to do that. I can't even begin to think what I would go through emotionally and mentally and spiritually. But I do think that we can conclude from this that the more difficult the obedience, the more excellent the obedience is. Let me say that again. The more difficult the obedience, the more excellent obedience is. And the more difficult the obedience, the more self-denial there is in it. So here we have an obedience that takes tremendous self-denial on Abraham's part and is therefore the most excellent obedience. You see, Abraham passed the test. And God says, "Now I know that you fear me." In other words, Abraham, I know that you truly love me, you truly follow me, whatever the cost. I mean, my friends, what a trial. What a test to have to go through. Now, the commentary on this trial of Abraham is actually given to us in the New Testament. It's found in the 11th chapter of Hebrews, where it comments back on this whole experience that we've just read about and talked about here in Genesis chapter 22. And in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17, we find the commentary. And the question is, how did Abraham do this? How could he bring himself to do this, even if it meant taking the life of his own son, if he was to obey God? Well, Hebrews 11:17 tells us that very clearly. In fact, the first two words of verse 17 tell the whole story. By what or how did he do it? It says, here they are, by faith. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him. You see, this was a test. God was saying, this is a test. And when he was tested, the verse goes on to say, he offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. So how could he do that? Well, here it comes in verse 19 of Hebrews 11. Abraham reasoned or recognized the fact that God could even raise the dead. And so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. You know why he was willing to do that? You know why Abraham was willing to sacrifice the life of his son if that's what God wanted him to do? Because he believed. He believed that God could raise even the dead. Had he ever seen the dead raised before? Not that we're told, but he believed that God could raise even the dead. You see, what he really believed was this, that God was so true to his word that if he made a promise, he would even raise the dead to keep it. That, my friends, is a tremendous faith. Abraham believed that God had given him that promise that through Isaac, he would build a great nation of him. And he knew that if God took Isaac's life, even by his own hand, that God would have to fulfill and keep his promise, and that he would raise Isaac from the dead, because God is not a liar. I wonder if Abraham was a little disappointed when he wasn't allowed to take his son's life, because maybe he would like to have seen a resurrection. Now, we don't know that for a fact, and I'm not trying to be, ludicrous about this or make light of a serious situation. But regardless, he believed that even if he took Isaac's life, that God would raise Isaac from the dead. Now, what does that tell us? Well, what that tells us is this, that a person can go through the most severe and imaginable trial or test of life if he or she really trusts God. And if they believe that God is on the throne and that God will keep his promises and that God never makes mistakes and that God always fulfills his word and that God will accomplish his purposes, that person can go through the most severe and imaginable trial of life because they are fully, completely trusting in the Lord. You see, that's the kind of faith that passes the test, the trial. And when Abraham was put through that test, that trial, when he was tried or tested, he passed. Is it any wonder that this man is the single greatest human model of faith recorded for us in Scripture? In Galatians chapter 3, verse 7, it says this, "Know you therefore that they who are of faith are the sons of Abraham." You see, anybody who lives by faith in God is in a spiritual sense a son of Abraham. He is the father of those that are faithful to the Lord. He is the model of faith for us. Verse 9 says, "They who are of faith are blessed with faithful Abraham." You see, he knew that through him, God said the nations of the world would be blessed. And he knew that God would keep his word and he would bring it to pass. Even if he killed Isaac, God would raise him back from the dead and keep his promise. Now, we have to realize that God is going to allow us to go through tests, right? And the thing that sustains us in the midst of that is our trust in God. Our faith that God is somehow working all things out in our lives for his own holy purpose and for our good. I know we dream of a world of ease, of worldly ease, and we like to create a perfect environment. We want to have absolute comfort in our lives. We want to get through all the rough spots in life. We want to make sure everything is just perfectly settled. And honestly, I have never experienced such a moment in my life. Every once in a while I think I'm there, and then I kind of discover and find out that I'm not there. But the fact that we have temporary rest and temporary ease sort of fools us into thinking that we might find a permanent exemption from testing and trial. But that's not the case. Do you remember the words of the psalmist in Psalm 30, verse 6, where he says, "In my prosperity I said I shall never be moved." Now what he's implying there is this: but I was wrong. When I was comfortable, I thought it would always be like this. But he says, I was wrong. And you can live in a fool's paradise if you want, never forecasting any trouble, promising yourself ease. But that isn't what Jesus promised. That isn't what Jesus said. He said, in fact, in John 16, verse 33, "I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. But in this world you will have trouble. But take heart, I have overcome the world." Psalm 23 says what? "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." You see, my friends, trials will come. But our confidence must be in the presence and power of God to deliver us through them. We must change our perspective so we see life through the prism of God's eyes. We must see life from God's vantage point, through his eyes. And it's only then that we can learn to trust him to deliver us through the trials and the test of life.